today. I'm Illia, co-founder of NEAR Protocol, and I would like to talk about evolving ecosystem governance. And so for NEAR, the mission from the start has been a world where people have control of their assets, their data, and importantly, power of governance, right? What does this mean? This means that as a user, as a person, you can kind of participate in decisions made, and you have the ability to, exit if you don't agree with the majority. Now, as we probably all know, there's not that kind of working governance yet, especially on the protocol levels. Many DAOs have, kind of been wobbling around kind of how to make it work. And kind of for us to, make meaningful progress, right, to actually be representing stakeholders, to actually be making decisions that are better than, any single person can make, we need to start figuring this out, right? And so we need to start with our own communities. And even more importantly, we need to start doing this because we only will learn from doing it, and then we can iterate, right? We can improve. And so for us, I've been thinking about this topic from 2019. We have tried a bunch of small experiments, and we're starting to kind of put this together. But it's not a perfect solution, right? It's not going to be a perfect governance system. None of them will be. But we can start making progress. So why do we need governance kind of more broadly? Well, ecosystems are in some ways like companies, but decentralized. They have lots of different participants, lots of different interests. There is kind of the basic token holder interests. There's people who are building stuff. There's different tokens in the ecosystem. There's companies that are doing stuff, and so there is kind of limitation to how much kind of self-coordination can happen. Right, and some politics will arise, the bureaucracy will arise, and more importantly, because there's no clear decision makers for different topics, you'll have this kind of missing opportunities. You'll have the ability not to make decisions, right, and to stall, and maybe until somebody actually uses their political power and pushes stuff. But at the end, it's not a process, right? It's kind of very individual based. And if we're talking about public goods, right, which is the biggest topic of blockchain, there's the public goods and there's things that have value capture. Well, somebody needs to do them. Somebody needs to continue building the protocol. Somebody needs to fund the infrastructure and tooling that is available to everyone and that does not directly generate revenue, right? We're talking about open source. This is the same problems that Linux has. It's the same problem that OpenStack has. All of this existing large projects that coordinate tens of thousands of developers have these problems. And by the way, they don't have a good solution either. So we have a lot of tools. We have a lot of things we invented. We have the blockchain itself to coordinate things. But it's still difficult. There's people involved. And we need to figure out how to build this for future, how to make it resilient, how to kind of make it evolve as things progress. So let's look at governance outside of Web3, right? So I would say there's two main domains. So there's a public domain, a government, and the current system, I would say, however imperfect it is, usually splits the power between 2 or 3 main branches, right? There's a branch that represents the kind of the country, that the Congress. It may have different kind of houses or House of Representatives and the Congress, but there is another branch which is a executive branch. This is a branch that gets elected and goes in with implementing some platform. They actually are kind of operate within the limits, but they have a very clear mandate. And obviously governments really focus on public goods and kind of economy growth. And then you have corporations. Corporations have a very clear executive vertical from the start. And for the most part, this executive vertical is kind of deciding on most of the day-to-day stuff with some oversight from board and from shareholders. But its kind of only focus is kind of profit maximization, right? That's their end goal. And this is why, using this corporate structure for blockchains end up, kind of misleading because we have a lot of public goods that need to be taken care of. So as I mentioned, we have been building a bunch of stuff. We have been trying a bunch of stuff. The kind of overall, there's been, 5 years, 6 years of DAO kind of experiments. Some failed dramatically, some failed less dramatically, some have been kind of making steady progress. But the lessons have been is that if you have a protocol foundation, right, Ethereum Foundation, NEAR Foundation, Web3 Foundation, right, all of each protocol has a foundation, but it's always trying to reduce its control over the ecosystem, right? It starts kind of by launching this network, but it cannot kind of continue, maintaining and pushing it because otherwise people will rely on foundation to do everything, right? And then, we go back to the corporate structure we started with. You have DAOs, right? You have tools and people have kind of came together. But the reality is, unless you have very clear roles and very clear rules on how things work, these DAOs usually kind of stall, right? And many people kind of coming in on enthusiasm, work a little bit, and unless they're getting paid and have a clear structured role, they just leave, right? They do something else. And so there are kind of two major approaches have emerged, right, for a DAOs. One is token weighted, where you have people who have tokens, who have vested interest in this protocol, a DAO, or whatever that is, and they vote for some decisions. So this is with Snapshot, with like Compound DAO, Uniswap DAO, etc. And usually, because there's really large holders that just individually would have voted everything in, there's some kind of like quadratic voting or some other form of reduction of the whale vote. Now, what came pretty clearly right after that is that that's not enough, and so Uniswap and a few others have a smaller group of individuals who are kind of actually doing the decisions, right? So even though there is a token vote, that is not enforceable, it's not actually executable right away. There's a smaller group of individuals who are usually reviewing proposals or making them and then actually executing, right? They're multi-sig pretty much holders. And this group does not grow very well, right? As this group grows beyond like 15 people, we actually see a very clear like decrease in participation. And this I'm looking at some participant of a DAO that has this problem at 21 members. And so like you kind of cannot engage big groups in this, and you need to split them, you need to have smaller DAOs, and you need some form of kind of coordination. And so each of this comes with its own challenges, and some have combined. We have been doing kind of Astro DAO, which is our framework for DAOs, which allows to configure any of these ways. You can configure multiple groups with different permissions, and you can we have few like 100+ active DAOs every week, and so they've been experimenting with all this stuff, and kind of few of these things emerged from there. Now, just to mention, like on the NEAR ecosystem itself, we actually went with the decentralization route, right? We have kind of the original team that started NEAR and built a lot of the original kind of protocol have went across many different companies and teams and building sub-protocols or focusing on different dimensions and verticals of building, right? So there's Pagoda and Calimero kind of contributing to the protocol and developing their own offerings to developers. There's Aurora, which is offering for EVM. There's Machina, which is data storage, Octopus, which is kind of side chains. There's Proximity and Human Guild, which focus on gaming and DeFi. And so there's a lot of different kind of focuses and verticals that are kind of in parallel are expanding the ecosystem, which is amazing. And this is kind of what we want from the ecosystem, right? It's not kind of a single company that marches in one direction. It's kind of grows in all directions at the same time. Now, the problem is, right, with this, as we mentioned, then you kind of lack coordination and lack actually a clear single path that people can work on. And so kind of the solution I want to propose here is NEAR Digital Cooperative. This is not, obviously a perfect governance solution, as I mentioned, but, we want to start iterating on this and putting this in place and figure out what works and what doesn't. And so kind of the main idea is on this slide. The main idea is you have this treasury, right? At the end, you're managing resources. Obviously, it's not just about money. It's about, the positioning and influence and people who are working on it. But kind of at the core, there is some treasury that is distributed. There's a Congress, so there's a representative form of governance that can be making decisions and approving votes. And so it splits into two houses. So as I mentioned, there's two major ways to do it. And so we actually do both. And then there's an executive part. And so executive part is where the accountability and execution and strategy comes from. So yeah, I mean, I just talked through the slide. And kind of think of this as a meta DAO, right? It kind of combines a DAO that has the token holders, it combines a DAO that has kind of merit, and I'll talk about this in a second, and it combines the executive kind of branch, which functions more as a company, but it still, is represented by an account on the blockchain and is able transparently to make decisions for everyone to discuss and comment. So principles of this, right? Like at the end, we're not going to make it perfect. We need to come from principles and iterate and evaluate if this system is following the principles we need. So the first principle is transparency, right? This is just kind of general NEAR ecosystem value of transparency, and we want all decisions to be publicly recorded. Now, that doesn't mean that all decisions will be publicly discussed. That's important because some decisions, you cannot discuss publicly because they actually affect some, for example, NDA thing, or they affect somebody personally, which you don't want to kind of expose to this. You want votes to be explained, right? So if you have somebody voting for a decision, they need to explain it. And you can still have a private voting within this, but you need some kind of reasoning behind it. And you want to kind of emphasize communication, right? Like at the end, this will be the successful system is almost over-communicating at all times and kind of creating this transparency. We want to be kind of goal and KPI driven. Like at the end, there is like, we all trying to shy away a little bit from, some of the major KPIs this network has, but they are there and everybody looking at them, right? For example, token price. And there's also other KPIs, right? Active users. There's other KPIs, which is, how many successful companies you have in the ecosystem. And so all of those things are important and important for like publicly pronouncing that these things are important and tracking them and actually keeping the executive team and the Congress accountable to this. And we want to minimize politics, right? We did not start, in blockchain to do politics, although this is inevitable where there's politics. But there's a few principles we can use to minimize it, right? Again, transparency is part of it. A clear map of of responsibilities as well, right? So, if we have this House and we have this Congress and executive, having clear responsibilities, yet making sure that there is no kind of overlap, and if there's overlap, to actually have a process to resolve it. So House of Merit, right? House of Merit is kind of this idea that there needs to be a small number of active contributors, right? People who are pretty much spending their full time in this ecosystem, and they are, they are pretty much invested with their time, right? It's pretty much like if you think of stake as your money, merit is your time. And also, it's not just investment, it's also the result, the outcome of this is that you have brought kind of value to the ecosystem. You grew ecosystem in some way. And so the process is, pretty straightforward. You apply publicly, you provide pretty much what have you done for the ecosystem, and kind of the existing members vote on this, but you have a public deliberation so people can kind of provide, supporting or non-supporting evidence. And there's, a lot of kind of functionality that needs to be built out here, but we can start with kind of, MVP of this and evaluate. And House of Merit has, importantly, a veto power over executive branch. They are able to pretty much block and potentially fire the executive and kind of evaluate it. So in a way, it functions as a board for the ecosystem. And in normal circumstances, right, it pretty much will provide the input from all of the kind of different places these people are coming from, and deciding on the budget, right, from the Treasury, for the executive, for ecosystem, for the next quarter, for example. And so the idea is that it focuses on success of kind of ecosystem as a whole on a long term. So House of Stake is like this open participation, right? This is what we've been wanting in blockchain. Like everybody can participate at any time from everywhere. It doesn't matter what your any of the protected things are. Like it doesn't matter because you're represented by the address and you can do it. And so the idea here is it's defined by kind of quadratic voting, root square of your stake, so actual delegated or direct stake on NEAR. And it's really for large referendums, right? It's for idea when something with the normal system is going wrong, and you can actually like overturn and veto merit, you can overturn executive with a large quorum. And this kind of, having this is a backstop and focus on economic ecosystem, but it's also a place where somebody can come up, even if they have a smaller stake, and propose some ideas, right? It's pretty much a way kind of to surface the referendum ideas that right now you would need like 100,000 signatures, right? If you want to go and propose something in change.org, right? For the White House to review. So this is a way to kind of surface broader ideas. And so the important piece, right? The piece that I believe is missing in most of the DAOs right now, or it is there, but it's not actually kind of declared properly, because usually if the DAO is doing something, there's somebody doing stuff and being accountable for it, is this idea of executive branch, right? And like, forgive my terminology, I mean, I just wanted to kind of differentiate it from CEOs and CTOs. So it's the minister and president. And so the idea is like you have the kind of a singular, person who is responsible for strategy and for those goals, and who is accountable for those goals to the kind of community and ecosystem as a whole. And if they're not doing it well, they can be fired by this, House of Merit and House of Stake. And so they would have, ministers who are responsible for each vertical, and they will be coordinating kind of the public good distribution and kind of defining which parts of the economy are important in which places, and actually helping with inorganic growth. Again, the same as, for example, you have governments that, kind of invest or subsidize some specific branches. And so at the end, you have Treasury, right? So this is where the funds are stored, and kind of the what allows for these branches to be able to delegate power and execute on specific needs of the ecosystem. And in a way, this will become kind of fund-of-fund strategy at the end, right? At the end, it will be, deploying capital into different funds and different organizations, which will be deploying things across the ecosystem. But this deployment itself is a strategy, right? It's a definition of what's important in the ecosystem at any specific point of time. So how do we get this right? I mean, it's, again, as I said, and I'm going to repeat this many times, it's not going to be perfect initially. But decentralization doesn't need to mean chaos, right? It doesn't need to mean that nobody's responsible for anything. And so we need to kind of continue doing it, and we need to figure out a way to manage shared resources. The smaller groups, faster decision making, kind of having some vertical of is important, and then having the oversight and transparency is important. Meta governance, again, at the end, we'll be reviewing this, and we'll reevaluate, benchmark it with the whole ecosystem, have an open discussion, and see if this process needs to be improved. So this requires participation. This requires feedback. So join us. We'll have more information posted on Governance Forum in a couple of days. So please join it, join the discussion, and join any of these houses as you wish. Thank you. Questions? No.
Hi. Yeah, I really appreciate you actually trying to tackle this sort of not having decentralization equal disorganization. One thing I wonder is, so in terms of modeling, right, separating powers doesn't mean that people that are looking to, monopolize on their position will look at how crossing different angles, influencing other people and other votes, trying to, to whatever extent you try to have the, quadratic, staking voting, tied to individual people so that it's, non-Sybil other things. So, how far along have you gone on, like, what are the anticipated attacks, or like what's the strategy going to be as for how much you try to do this ahead of time versus seeing it in the wild and then reacting to the attacks, iteratively? Yeah, so it's a good question. Like, I mean, any governance is susceptible to some form of, demagogue or influence or buyout, right? And we see that in every single country right now. And so I think like the idea here, one is to think through some of these attacks kind of the standard things. Stake and quadratic voting, merit, and kind of thinking through that process and making it more kind of more objective, as much objective as you possibly can, right?
At the same time, it's true that like there will be soft powers. Like this is not going anywhere. And so this is why it's important to have the kind of judgments, the votes be explained. Like I think this is the biggest part right now, that people don't need to explain when they vote, right, on why they voted in this way. And so you are not able to evaluate if what your congressman is saying is because they're getting paid or because they actually believe in this and their beliefs are consistent, right? And so I think building out sound infrastructure where you can actually look at a specific individual or specific group, right, and seeing if their kind of posted beliefs and their votes are consistent, and if not, having a process of them being kind of removed, fired, right, is important. So I think like we'll need to figure out some of the mechanisms, but transparency as a goal is important here. And I think like we have the tools to do it, which, for example, governments do not. And so I think that's the biggest benefit, that we can have this iteration. And also like we're way smaller as a, as an ecosystem overall, so we're able to iterate and we're able to do this versus if you try to iterate on a US Congress or something, that's not really possible.
Okay, a couple of questions. First one, where is the foundation in all of this setup? This is the first question. And second question is that usually in governments there are courts, which are actually much more complicated system just comparing just vetoing. Maybe, and there is no, in this scheme, there is no such thing that actually does the judicative branch.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what to do with it? Maybe you need to add it there.
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this a lot, and we definitely need a conflict resolution court system. I think we will get there. How it will play their role over time. I think pretty much as soon as we have like a full-on block of the system, probably we'll need it. I think like introducing right now without having reputation, without having kind of clear tools to evaluate decisions, right now it's kind of not the right time. And like we just don't have tools. Like you can say like, hey, cool, this few people are judges, now what? Right? We don't have, but on the other side, like we do have code, and so a lot of things we can actually program, and like, a lot of the judiciary side like is either enforcing existing laws or precedent building. And so I think for precedent building, we'll need to build some kind of reputation system, and that's why, at least right now, I hope, and we'll see, right, but the hypothesis is that House of Merit will be able to build precedents, and maybe that's not true, and then we'll need to evaluate and kind of propose a different system. On the foundation side, foundation is, is fund-of-fund structure right now, right? It's deploying capital across the ecosystem, and so it will continue doing that, and it can be working together with this executive branch, right, to deploy it within the kind of mission of the ecosystem.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for all the things that you put together in the presentation. Really was very useful for a lot of us. My question, I think, is kind of related with the previous one. Is on-chain versus off-chain voting? How you see the future? Because typically there are those problems which are very complex, at least to resolve through on-chain voting at least at first. So do you see the coexistence? Do you see one form dominating the other? What's your opinion on that?
So what we've seen so far with DAO, for example, all of the votes are on-chain, right? And that works fine. The thing is, all the discussion happens off-chain in Telegram groups and Discord and forum, etc. And so there's very weak linkage on this, and kind of that's why there's the reputation lack and some other stuff. I think actually like the talk before it at the boat was discussing on how to build a social on top of NEAR ecosystem, and so how to link people's reputation, how to create followers, how to create groups, it's all the stuff. And so as we build out some of that infrastructure, I think the discussions, the conversations can be still linked. That doesn't mean that everything needs to be public. So on-chain doesn't always mean public. We have people building private voting on-chain. So you can have a private voting where the vote is not exposed, but you, for example, can have all the reasoning published in some shape or form, right? So there's ways to create this, and on-chain is just a way to facilitate the aggregation of the final vote. Now, there's also a separate step, which is execution. That's why it's actually important to disentangle the on-chain vote and saying like, okay, we voted for this, now this needs to happen, and actual execution, because execution can be complex. it doesn't always mean, execute this transaction on chain. It can be like go, make a deal with, IBM for them to do like allocate 100 engineers to build an alternative client, right? For example. And so that execution, that's why you have executive branch, which can go out and do this and will be accountable to this vote, right? And if they don't do it, they'll get fired over time, right? All right, thanks everyone. Hope you enjoyed it.